Have you ever watched a movie or TV show and thought, is that really how things happened? It's no secret that entertainment doesn't always get history right. From injecting needles into hearts to pirates speaking like they're straight out of a cheesy movie, there's a lot that gets exaggerated or completely wrong. But today, let's talk about something even more mind-blowing: castles and how they were actually defended during the medieval times. Castles are often shown as these impenetrable fortresses, and we all know about knights and battles, right? But do you know how hard it actually was to capture a castle? It wasn't easy. In fact, capturing a castle or a walled city was one of the toughest challenges for any army, and the stories we see in movies don't even come close to showing just how difficult it was. Imagine this: a huge stone castle with thick walls, weapons, and defenses that could stand up to almost anything. Now think about how armies would try to break through these walls. Would they storm it with sheer force? Would they try to break the gates down? What tools did they use? You'd be shocked to learn that most of what you think you know about medieval sieges might be wrong. Did you know that most castles were rarely ever captured through brute force? In fact, sieging a castle was incredibly hard, and it often took months to even get close to breaking through. And when castles did fall, it wasn't always through fighting. Sometimes it was because the defending soldiers simply gave up or negotiated a surrender. Stick with me, because we're about to dive into how these massive medieval fortresses were defended, and you might just be surprised at what actually worked and what didn't when it came to protecting these giant stone buildings. Plus, I'll tell you why castles didn't stay as strong as people think, and how they were eventually outsmarted. So, let's explore the real ways castles were attacked and defended. Forget what movies tell you. The history behind these battles is a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting. Imagine being trapped inside a giant fortress, surrounded by an enemy army. You have to defend your castle at all costs. But how do you win? What makes a siege successful, and how could you survive one? Let's dive into the world of medieval sieges and uncover some of the surprising tactics and challenges involved. In medieval times, castles weren't just pretty buildings, they were vital for defense and survival. Castles were incredibly tough to attack, even for large armies. Many sieges never even happened simply because castles were such strong deterrents. No one wanted to waste time and resources trying to take them. But if a siege did occur, there were a few common ways defenders could win. First, if a castle was well fortified and big enough, the defenders could simply wait it out. The enemy would be forced to camp outside, slowly running out of food, water, and morale. If the castle had enough supplies, the defenders could survive for months, even years, while the attackers struggled to maintain their siege. Second, sometimes an allied army would come to the rescue. If defenders could hold on long enough, they might get help from nearby forces to break the siege or even attack the enemy from behind, forcing them to retreat. Lastly, and by far the best way to win a siege, was simply outlasting the enemy. With thick walls, strong gates, and a well-prepared supply of food and water, the defenders could endure, while the attackers would grow tired and desperate. The attackers would either give up or, in many cases, run out of resources first. But here's the thing: besieging a castle wasn't easy, even for the most powerful armies. Did you know that, despite many castles being well defended, most were never even attacked? In fact, a study of castles in Belgium found that only 5 out of 150 were ever successfully captured. This makes you wonder, why even bother attacking? What made castles so hard to defeat? You might think that with enough soldiers, any castle could be taken. But what if I told you that even with 50 attackers for every defender, many castles still couldn't be taken? That's the real story of how castles shaped medieval warfare. In the end, it wasn't just about strength or numbers. It was about patience, resources, and the will to survive. So, next time you see a medieval castle, remember, it was a symbol of power and survival. Whether it was standing tall as a deterrent or withstanding a siege for months, castles played a huge role in medieval strategy. And while many castles fell, the ones that stood the test of time weren't always the strongest, they were the ones who could outlast the enemy. Imagine this, you are surrounded by a massive stone castle, its thick walls rising high into the sky. You have an army, but taking this fortress won't be easy. You can't just charge in and expect victory. In reality, sieging a castle wasn't as simple or dramatic as we often see in movies. So, how did it really work? Let's dive into the history and uncover the surprising truth behind medieval sieges. When it came to attacking a castle, the odds were usually in favor of the defenders. In fact, most sieges didn't end with a dramatic battle. They were more about negotiation and patience than force. If the attacking army couldn't break through quickly, they often had to wait, sometimes for months, until the defenders gave in, tired and starving. Take William the Conqueror, for example. History tells us he never lost a siege. But what's interesting is that he rarely relied on brute force. Instead, he often managed to win through negotiations. If his army couldn't take a castle right away, he'd offer favorable terms, convincing the defenders to surrender without a fight. But let's say a direct assault was the only option. What did it really take to storm a castle? You might be surprised to learn that it wasn't just about having the biggest army. The success of a siege depended on many factors, from surprise attacks to careful planning and managing resources. So, was it possible to actually take a castle with just a few soldiers? Believe it or not, sometimes yes. There's an incredible story from medieval Belgium where only a handful of knights and peasants managed to take a castle simply because they arrived while the gates were still open. One soldier forgot to lock it. It's a perfect example of how sometimes all you needed was the right timing. But if the surprise attack didn't work, things got much harder. The real challenge came in the form of logistics and preparation. Before attacking a castle, an army had to plan everything carefully. What troops could they rely on? How many supplies could they carry? How long could they sustain a siege? Could they cut off the defenders' resources and force them to surrender? In fact, the true cost of a siege wasn't just in the number of soldiers. It was in managing supplies, food, weapons, tools, and even the workers who built the siege engines. The more resources an attacking army could gather, the longer they could last, and the better their chances of victory. But these sieges could be incredibly costly. In the end, taking a castle wasn't just about attacking. It was about strategy, patience, and sometimes just waiting for the defenders to give up. And often, the best way to win a siege wasn't by fighting at all, but by making sure your enemy couldn't hold out any longer. So, next time you watch a movie about castles being stormed, remember, most of the time, the battle was decided long before the first sword was drawn. And that's the surprising truth about medieval sieges. Imagine you've planned your siege meticulously, every detail covered, your army is in place, and you are ready to strike. But what happens next? Do you rush straight to the castle walls and start fighting? Or is there more to it than just storming the gates? Sieging a castle isn't as simple as just charging the walls. The reality is much more complex and often involves long periods of waiting, negotiating, and strategizing. When an army arrived to lay siege to a castle, the first thing they usually did was not attack but instead they sent someone in to talk. Why? Because most of the time, attacking a well-defended castle directly could be a disaster. Castle walls were thick, strong, and hard to break through. And let's not forget, defenders had plenty of ways to make your life miserable, whether it was pouring boiling oil, raining arrows, or dropping huge stones from above. The key to success often lay in patience. The attackers would try to get the defenders to surrender peacefully, and in some cases, they'd offer temporary truces to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. This truce allowed both sides to rest and assess their situation, kind of like a timeout in a game. So, what did these negotiations really look like? And how often did they work? You might be surprised by how many sieges were decided without a single sword being swung. Stay tuned, because by the end of this video, you'll discover how a strategic talk could sometimes save thousands of lives and even lead to a victory without any fighting at all. In fact, many times, attackers would set terms like, "If relief forces don't come by this date, we'll surrender." Sounds crazy, right? But it worked more often than you'd think. One example of this was in 1415 during the siege of Harfleur, where the defenders actually agreed to surrender without further fighting. Here's how it would unfold. Arrival and negotiation. When an army arrived to besiege a castle, they'd first ask the defenders to surrender peacefully. If that didn't work, they'd try to set a temporary truce, allowing both sides a break from constant fighting. This gave everyone time to think things through. Setting terms. Sometimes, the attackers and defenders would set conditions for the siege. For example, in 1415, during the siege of Harfleur, the defenders agreed to hold out until a certain date. If no reinforcements came by then, they'd surrender. This gave both sides time to prepare for the worst while avoiding pointless loss of life. The power of patience. Rather than attacking immediately, many attackers waited to see if the castle would give in or if reinforcements would arrive. Attacking too soon could mean heavy casualties, while waiting might lead to a peaceful resolution if the attackers had the patience to wait. Victory through negotiation. The example at Harfleur shows how a carefully negotiated surrender saved a lot of lives. The defenders were allowed to leave unharmed, and the town's leaders were given a chance to avoid a worse fate. A peaceful resolution might sound too easy, but in reality, it was often the best choice for everyone involved. Sieges weren't all about massive battles and bloodshed. Often, the most successful sieges were those that never saw much fighting at all. Sometimes, the real power came from talking things through, setting conditions, and waiting for the right moment to strike. So, the next time you see a movie with an epic castle siege, remember, not all sieges were won with swords. Some were won with patience, clever negotiations, and timing. Have you ever wondered how medieval armies won sieges? It wasn't always about fighting to the death. Sometimes, the real victory came from negotiations behind the walls. Today, we are diving into an unexpected twist in military strategy, how a clever deal could save both castles and lives. Stick around to the end to discover how one castle held out for months, and what finally made the defenders agree to surrender. When a castle was surrounded, the defenders often faced a difficult decision: hold out or negotiate. A siege could last for weeks or even months, and if the defenders weren't getting any outside help, they were running out of food and supplies fast. In some cases, it made more sense to negotiate a deal rather than keep fighting to the bitter end. Now, here's the trick. Sometimes, the attackers were more interested in saving resources than storming the walls. If they knew that a castle was nearly impossible to take by force, they might offer a deal. The defenders could surrender, and in exchange, they'd be allowed to leave unharmed. This would save both sides time, energy, and lives. But there was another reason behind these negotiations: making the enemy look weak. If a commander could drag out a siege long enough, and then surrender with a good excuse like waiting for relief forces that never came, it could make the enemy seem ineffective. The defenders could claim, "We held out as long as we could, but it was out of our hands." It could even motivate allies to come to their aid if there was still a chance to win the war. One famous example of this happened in 1326 at Carew Castle in Wales. Despite being surrounded for 4 months, the defenders didn't rush to surrender. They were offered great terms early on. The attackers promised to spare everyone inside if they just handed over a teenager named Hugh Le Despencer, a person they really wanted. But instead of surrendering, the defenders held strong, keeping their valuable treasury and refusing to give up Hugh. You might think a small force could never win a siege against a stronghold like Carew Castle. But the attackers weren't worried about storming the walls. They just needed to wait. The real challenge was making the defenders hungry, tired, and desperate enough to consider a surrender. So, what happened after 4 long months? Did the defenders give in? Or was there another twist in this medieval standoff? Stay tuned to find out how a simple negotiation turned the tide of the siege and saved countless lives. In the end, after months of waiting and careful negotiation, the defenders at Carew Castle agreed to surrender. They saved their lives and kept their honor, but not without paying a price. The attackers got what they wanted: Hugh Le Despencer and the castle's treasure. This was a perfect example of how not every siege ends with a bloody battle. Sometimes, the best strategy is simply to wait and negotiate. So, next time you hear about a siege, remember that the outcome wasn't always decided by who had the bigger army. Sometimes, it was all about waiting, bargaining, and knowing when to make a deal. Imagine you are laying siege to a fortress. Your soldiers are ready, but the castle is well protected. What do you do now? Do you charge in and risk losing everything, or is there a smarter, cheaper way to win? In this video, we are going to dive into the fascinating strategies used in medieval sieges and how you might use tricks and tactics to force a surrender without ever fighting a single battle. In medieval times, sieging a castle wasn't just about smashing through the gates or breaking down walls. It was about using brains and strategy to force a surrender. Sure, you could try to attack the castle with your army, but that could end in disaster. Even if you had the troops and the weapons, the cost of a long siege could drain your resources. So what do you do? Well, you can try something more devious. One of the smartest tactics was to work from the inside. What if you could find someone inside the castle willing to betray their own people? This could be a soldier, a servant, or anyone with access to important supplies. If you could bribe or convince them to destroy food stores, open gates, or even sabotage defenses, you could break the siege without ever fighting. And it would save you a lot of time and resources. Think about it, you are waiting outside the walls, watching as your enemies inside run out of food. They are stuck, and the longer the siege lasts, the weaker they get. But imagine the twist, someone inside decides to help you. They destroy supplies or sabotage the walls. Now, the castle is on the verge of collapse, and it wasn't even your soldiers doing the work. How much easier and cheaper would that make your victory? One famous historical example comes from the Roman siege of Jerusalem, where the Israelites were forced to fight after zealots destroyed their own food supplies. This is a great reminder that in a siege, breaking the enemy's supply lines can be just as powerful as any weapon. So, could you win a siege without ever fighting? Absolutely. Whether it's through inside betrayal, demoralization, or cutting off supplies, the smartest generals knew that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that doesn't require a single arrow to be shot. In the end, if all peaceful options fail and you are left with no choice but to attack, the best move is to set up your siege carefully. Build your defenses to protect your troops from any outside attacks and make sure no supplies can get in or out. After all, the goal is not to storm the gates but to make the enemy give up first. Sounds strange, right? But in 1096, Gerald de Windsor used this bizarre tactic to trick his enemies and save a castle. Today, let's dive into this clever military strategy, plus how sieges and attacks were really carried out in medieval times. It's not what Hollywood usually shows. Main concept: the pigs and the letter. So, what exactly happened with these pigs? Gerald de Windsor was inside Pembroke Castle, under siege in 1096. Now, his enemies thought they could starve him out. But Gerald had a clever trick up his sleeve. Instead of waiting for the siege to end, he did something unexpected. He threw 4 pigs at the enemy. And that's not all, he also sent a letter to his allies, claiming that he had enough food to last 4 more months. His enemies intercepted the letter and believed it. They thought, well, if they have 4 months of supplies, this siege will be too long and too costly. Let's just leave. But the truth: Gerald and his people had very little food left except those pigs. If the trick hadn't worked, they would have run out of supplies quickly and had no choice but to surrender. Now, this might make you wonder, how did sieges really work back then? Were they just like the movies, with giant catapults launching rocks, armies charging at castle walls, and epic battles? Not exactly. In reality, medieval sieges were a lot more strategic and patient than what Hollywood portrays. For example, attacking a castle wasn't as simple as throwing everything you had at it. Imagine trying to storm a castle where arrows are raining down from above and huge stones are being hurled at you. It wasn't easy or fast. So, how did attackers manage to break into a castle in real life? No rush to attack, soldiers didn't just rush at the walls blindly. They needed shields or protection, like pavises, big, movable shields, and sometimes siege engines to help them get closer without being killed. Focus on weaknesses. It wasn't about attacking the castle at just one point. A good strategy involved attacking from multiple sides to divide the defending forces. Castles often had just a few defenders, so spreading them thin made the attackers' job easier. Protection for soldiers. Soldiers couldn't afford to just run to the walls and hope for the best. They used shields or siege towers to protect themselves from arrows and fire. This was a long and dangerous process. The dangers of storming the walls. In 1346, Sir Edmund Springhouse tried to lead his men in a rush up a ladder at the siege of Caen. Unfortunately, he slipped, fell, and was killed when the defenders threw burning straw at him. Talk about a bad day. Sieges weren't just about brute force. They were about patience, smart tactics, and sometimes psyching out the enemy, just like Gerald did with the pigs and the fake letter. By making your enemy believe you have more resources than you really do, you could force them to back down. In the end, sieging a castle wasn't about rushing in with full force. It was about finding weaknesses, using strategies, and sometimes waiting for the right moment to strike. And maybe, just maybe, throwing some pigs in the mix. So next time you watch a movie about a siege, just remember, it's not always as dramatic as it seems. Real-life tactics were far more calculated and smart. Want to learn more about strange medieval tricks and strategies? Have you ever wondered why moats were such an important feature in castles, and why they're often not what you think? Most people picture a deep, water-filled moat with crocodiles and alligators. But the truth about moats is much more interesting and practical. Let's explore how they were used to protect castles, and how they made sieges a lot more challenging for attackers. Moats have been around for thousands of years, protecting castles, cities, and even homes. The main purpose of a moat was to stop attackers from reaching the walls of a fortress. But it wasn't just about stopping soldiers. Moats also made it harder for enemies to use certain siege weapons, like battering rams, and even prevented them from digging tunnels to breach the walls. Now, the water-filled moat we all imagine wasn't always the case. While there were some moats with water, many were just deep, empty pits dug around the castle. Water moats needed a constant supply of fresh water to stay clean, and keeping them from becoming stinky, mosquito-filled swamps was a lot of work. In fact, water-filled moats weren't always as effective as they seem. They did help in some cases, especially if there was a natural water source nearby, but a dry moat could still be just as useful in stopping attackers from tunneling under the walls. And without the hassle of managing water. But here's the twist: despite the classic image of crocodiles lurking in the water, no one ever actually used them in moats. Why? It turns out, they were just too expensive and risky. Crocodiles and alligators don't always live in cold climates, and they could escape and cause chaos. Plus, they didn't make the castle any harder to conquer. The real purpose of moats was to stop a technique called mining, where attackers would dig tunnels beneath the walls to collapse them. Moats were dug deep, sometimes all the way down to bedrock, to make sure these tunnels couldn't reach the castle. The deeper the moat, the harder it was for miners to tunnel under and destroy the walls above. So, next time you think of a castle surrounded by a water-filled moat, remember, it was a practical defense against siege tactics and mining, not just a pretty decoration. And who knew that the real secret to moats was in the depth, not the water? Imagine you're in the middle of a massive medieval castle siege. You're facing towering walls, a moat filled with danger, and enemies raining down rocks and arrows from above. But here's the thing: getting past those walls isn't as easy as just throwing more rocks at them. Castles were incredibly hard to breach, and today, I'm going to show you why these fortresses were almost unbeatable until one thing made all the difference. Castles were designed to withstand just about everything. Let's talk about moats first. Yes, we all know moats were meant to stop attackers from getting close, But did you know they were more than just water-filled ditches? Some of the wealthiest castle owners filled their moats with dangerous animals like crocodiles and alligators, adding another layer of protection. However, in some cases, these moats were also a status symbol. Wealthy owners even filled their moats with fish, creating a private fishery. Imagine fishing from your castle walls while your enemies struggled to figure out how to cross the moat. Now, not all moats were filled with water. In some places, like at Krmlov Castle in the Czech Republic, there was something unique, a bear moat. Yes, you heard that right. Bears were kept in the moat, and while it's not clear exactly when this started, the earliest mention of it goes all the way back to 1707. It was both a symbol of power and an extra deterrent for any attackers. But moats were only one part of the fortress's defense. When it came to attacking a castle, simply breaching the walls wasn't enough. You had to deal with everything from defensive walls to dangerous traps. And believe it or not, even when attackers did manage to break through a wall, they had to be careful about rushing in. It wasn't just about brute force. Sometimes, patience was the most powerful weapon. One of the best examples of this comes from the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215. King John of England bombarded the castle with huge siege engines for weeks without much success. But his secret weapon wasn't more bombs or cannons. It was something else, his sappers. These soldiers dug tunnels under the walls, causing them to collapse, and eventually they breached the castle. But even then, the defenders didn't just give up. They retreated into the keep, hoping to hold out longer. You might think that once a castle's walls were breached, the defenders were finished. But that's not how it worked. After breaching the walls, the attackers still had to be smart about how they moved in. Rushing in could cause heavy losses, and that could turn the tide of the siege. In fact, sometimes the best move wasn't to rush in at all, but to make an offer, one that could end the siege without losing any more soldiers. So, was it impossible to take a castle by force? Not exactly, but it wasn't easy. And that's why the next time you see a castle siege in a game or movie, you might want to think twice before you assume it was all about smashing the walls with big siege engines. In reality, it was more about strategy, patience, and sometimes just waiting your enemy out. Imagine being under siege, your enemies surrounding you, and you are running out of options. Now, picture something terrifying. The enemy hurls not just stones, but dead bodies infected with a deadly disease right into your city. How did this brutal tactic work? And what was one of the deadliest siege machines that made it all possible? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see how war tactics evolved and how one device capable of launching heavy objects changed the course of warfare forever. War has always been about power, strategy, and fear. In ancient times, the development of siege weapons was crucial. One such weapon, famously designed by Archimedes, was the claw of Archimedes. This device was a sort of giant crane. When enemy ships got too close to the shore, it could grab them and either flip them over or even lift them into the air, only to drop them back down, sometimes onto other boats. It was a terrifying weapon, one that showcased the power of ancient engineering. But there's more. This idea of launching heavy objects from a distance didn't end with Archimedes. It evolved over the centuries into what became one of the most feared siege engines ever, the counterweight trebuchet. The counterweight trebuchet was capable of throwing massive objects with deadly precision. But who invented it, And how did it impact castles and warfare? Surprisingly, no one really knows who invented the first counterweight trebuchet. But we do know it started being used during sieges as early as the 12th century. These machines could hurl massive rocks at walls, often breaking them down, and even more effectively, could repeatedly target the same area. One of the most notable early uses of the counterweight trebuchet was during the siege of Kaffa in 1346. The Mongol army, suffering from the deadly plague known as the Black Death, used their trebuchets in a truly horrific way. They launched diseased corpses into the city, hoping to infect the defenders. Imagine being trapped inside a city with the stench of rotting bodies filling the air and knowing that the disease was being deliberately spread through the city's water and food supply. The psychological impact was immense. So, did the Mongols use trebuchets to spread the Black Death? Absolutely. This terrifying tactic helped the Mongols weaken the defenders before even engaging in battle. It's not just about destruction, it's about making the enemy surrender from fear, disease, and despair. Now that you know the power of these weapons, imagine the devastation they could cause. From Archimedes' claw to the Mongol trebuchet, war machines evolved, but so did the tactics used to strike fear into the hearts of the enemy. Did you know that the Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in history, might have spread because of sailors unknowingly carrying the disease? Imagine coming back from a long voyage only to spread a deadly plague as you hugged your friends and family. But that's not all. How did medieval armies destroy castles and walls during sieges? With massive, heavy weapons like the werewolf, a giant trebuchet. Stick around to find out how these ancient machines worked and why building them was way harder than you might think. First, let's dive into the Black Death. Picture this: a group of sailors comes back home after months at sea, their ships having been delayed by terrible storms and tragic events. But when they finally dock, they are greeted by excited family and friends. What they didn't know was that they were carrying death itself. While they hugged loved ones, they unknowingly spread the Black Death. The disease likely spread across Europe this way, through human contact, but also through other means. This wasn't the only way the plague spread, but it was one of the main ways it reached new areas. Now, let's switch gears a bit. What about medieval siege warfare? Ever wondered how armies brought down massive castle walls? Were trebuchets really as common as movies make them seem? Not exactly. Building siege engines like the werewolf was no small task. Imagine needing 30 wagons just to transport the parts and 54 skilled workers to assemble it. And this wasn't just some quick weekend project. It took 3 whole months to get this giant trebuchet ready. Why would anyone go through all that effort? Because these machines could launch massive stones, weighing up to 300 pounds, and crush castle walls from hundreds of yards away. But despite their power, building them wasn't something you could just do on a whim. In fact, not all armies could afford to build huge trebuchets like werewolf. Most didn't have the expertise or resources to make them. So what did they use? Smaller, lighter weapons like mangonels. These were great for throwing rocks, but they weren't as accurate as trebuchets. And then there was the ballista, a giant crossbow that fired huge bolts with precision. The springald, a similar machine, was used not only in attacking but also by defenders. So, what happened when attackers used battering rams to break down doors? Well, it wasn't just about running up and smashing a log. These rams were carefully crafted, with animal skins and metal tips to make sure they could do the job without killing everyone trying to use them. But even then, defenders had tricks of their own, like setting the rams on fire. So, with all these crazy siege machines and strategies, how did castles even survive for so long? Ever wonder how armies attacked castles in the Middle Ages? Imagine being inside a massive fortress and watching as huge siege engines approach. From battering rams that smash walls to towering siege machines covered in mud to protect against fire, these weapons were the key to breaking into a castle. But here's the catch: building and using them wasn't easy or cheap. In fact, one of the longest sieges in English history almost broke the king's bank. Want to know more? Stick around. Let's start with battering rams. These weren't just giant logs pushed by soldiers. They were carefully built, often covered with hides and mud to protect them from being set on fire by defenders. The goal was to smash through a castle gate or wall. But the defenders weren't just going to let that happen. They tried everything, throwing heavy stones at the ram, using ropes to flip it over, or even placing obstacles in front of the gates to block it. Sometimes they even had moats filled with water or mud to stop the attackers from getting close. One famous example of a successful battering ram was used by Raymond VII of Toulouse in 1216 when he attacked the castle of Beaucaire. The ram, described as long, straight, and sharp, smashed through the walls, causing stones to fall. The defenders didn't panic, though. They used a clever trick to catch the ram's head with a rope, trying to stop it. But the attackers didn't give up. They sent engineers inside the castle to break through the wall with picks. The defenders fought back by dropping fire and sulfur, which created deadly smoke and fumes that made the attackers retreat. Eventually, the defenders were forced to give up. But this battle shows just how tricky and dangerous siege warfare could be. But battering rams weren't the only siege engines used. Have you ever heard of the siege tower or belfry? These massive structures were wheeled right up to the castle walls, offering protection from arrows and other attacks. They were sometimes hundreds of feet tall and could even have a drawbridge to drop onto the wall. Some siege towers were armed with weapons like ballistas, huge crossbows, to shoot at defenders as they approached. But they were vulnerable too. One of the most famous examples happened in 1266, when a siege tower was completely destroyed by a missile from the castle's defenses. Even with all the protection and weapons, it wasn't always enough. Siege warfare was expensive. King Henry III of England, for example, had to use 2,000 wooden shields and 60,000 crossbow bolts in one of the longest sieges in English history, 172 days. It cost him so much that he had to sell jewels just to pay for it. But despite all the money and resources, the siege failed. The defenders held out until they ran out of food and had to negotiate. They finally surrendered, but they had to agree to pay a huge fine, 5 times their yearly income. So why did these massive siege engines sometimes fail? Even though they could destroy walls and towers, the real power of a siege came from persistence, clever tactics, and sometimes a bit of luck. Despite all the resources and effort put into sieging castles, it wasn't always the attackers who won. Some defenders knew how to outsmart the attackers and force a surrender even if the odds were against them. Siege warfare wasn't just about building huge weapons, it was about strategy, resources, and sometimes surviving long enough to force a deal. It was a game of patience, power, and wits. Want to know more about the incredible siege tactics and how castles withstood such attacks? Imagine a time when a single weapon could decide the fate of an entire castle or city. The massive, intimidating battering ram and later, the cannon, which completely changed the way sieges were fought. Introduction. In medieval times, sieges were long, grueling battles. Castles were thought to be the ultimate defense against invaders. But what if I told you that, in the end, sieges often weren't won by strength, but by strategy and technology? Today, we are diving into the evolution of siege warfare, from the terrifying battering ram to the unstoppable force of the cannon, and how they changed the game. Let's start with the battering ram. To bring one of these huge weapons into position was no small task. Castles had moats, steep walls, and plenty of other defenses to stop invaders. Moving the ram into place meant the ground had to be smooth and level, and the enemy couldn't have siege engines of their own. Even when everything was just right, there were plenty of challenges. The weather, for example, could completely ruin your plans. High winds could knock over the ram, delaying your efforts. But if you managed to get it into position, it could smash through castle gates or walls, often making a huge impact. However, there was a new player on the battlefield, the cannon. Once the cannon was perfected, it was a game-changer. Unlike the cumbersome siege engines like the battering ram or the trebuchet, the cannon was easier to build, cheaper to transport, and could fire much more quickly. By the 15th century, cannons were starting to dominate siege warfare. They could breach walls more effectively, making them the go-to choice for attackers. One of the most famous examples of cannon power was the Siege of Harfleur. In this battle, the French army managed to breach the walls of the town with a battery of 12 cannons. This quickly led to the town surrendering after their walls were destroyed. In Spain, the cannons were used to break down the Moorish strongholds in Granada. Even though they built thicker walls to withstand these weapons, it wasn't enough. The cannon was simply too powerful. As a result, castles, once seen as invincible, became increasingly outdated. The future of defense shifted to strategically placed fortresses armed with heavy artillery like cannons. But the real question is, why didn't castles just keep getting stronger? And how did designers try to keep up with these new weapons? Italian architect Leon Battista Alberti came up with a clever design for walls that were shaped in a sawtooth pattern to make them harder to breach. These designs were a step in the right direction, but the cannon was still too much of a force to ignore. By the late 15th century, the cannon had completely transformed warfare. It wasn't just a tool, it was the king of all siege weapons. With it, attackers could now breach what were once considered impregnable fortresses, changing the entire landscape of medieval warfare. But there's more to this story. How did the defenders try to fight back? And what was life like during these long sieges? Was it really as dramatic as we see in movies, or was it more about patience, negotiation, and survival? In the end, the best way to win a siege was to avoid one altogether. Castles weren't just built to defend, they were built to deter attacks in the first place. But once a siege began, it wasn't about charging in and breaking down walls. It was about outlasting your enemy, making the right deals, and having the resources to outlast the enemy's efforts. After the battle, though, it wasn't all about glory. The aftermath often involved rebuilding, reclaiming land, and even taking revenge on the enemy. Castles might have fallen, but the art of siege warfare was far from over. Cannons, strategy, and the will to win would continue to shape the future of battles for years to come. Imagine being trapped in a massive fortress, surrounded by towering stone walls, and knowing that an army is relentlessly trying to break you and your comrades inside. How do you defend against a siege that could last months or even years? Castles in the Middle Ages weren't just strongholds, they were symbols of power and survival. But what would it really take to breach these seemingly impenetrable walls and conquer them? Was it all about brute force, or did attackers have more cunning tricks up their sleeves? Stick with us as we dive into the fascinating, bloody world of medieval sieges and uncover the strategies and weapons used to bring down one of the most formidable defenses in history. Main concept: understanding the siege. In the medieval era, castles were the ultimate symbol of defense and dominance. Built with thick stone walls, drawbridges, moats, and other defensive features, they seemed indestructible to any invading force. But in reality, sieging a castle was a complex and time-consuming ordeal that involved more than just attacking the walls. It was about cutting off supplies, psychological tactics, and using specialized weapons to destroy both the structure and the will of its defenders. The first key to a successful siege was to surround the castle and prevent any escape or resupply. Imagine being inside a castle, seeing the enemy army encircle your stronghold, and realizing you are cut off from the outside world. No food, no reinforcements. The attackers would often set up camp, sometimes for months, slowly starving out the defenders. But what if that wasn't enough? What if the walls themselves stood firm against any attempt to break through? To truly breach the castle walls, attackers had to bring out their most advanced siege weapons. How did they overcome towering defenses that seemed impossible to defeat? Could a battering ram really break down the stone gates? Could a giant wooden tower, taller than the castle itself, be used to reach the walls? These questions were not only about survival for the attackers, they were about the fate of entire kingdoms. The defenders would hold out as long as they could, but eventually, the attackers would use brutal methods to force them to surrender. Let's focus on some of the most terrifying tools of war used during a medieval siege. The battering ram was one of the first and most essential weapons. This large, heavy log was used to smash through gates, often with the aid of a protective wooden shelter to shield the attackers from arrows and boiling oil poured down by defenders. But battering rams weren't the only siege weapon. Imagine looking up and seeing a massive siege tower, a giant wooden structure on wheels, taller than the castle walls, moving toward your fortress. Attackers would climb these towers to scale the walls, gaining access to the inner courtyard. And then there were the trebuchets, giant catapults capable of launching enormous stones or even dead animals infected with disease over the walls. The goal was not just to break the defenses but to spread fear, cause chaos, and disrupt the defenders' morale. The sheer destruction caused by trebuchets could force even the most determined defenders to reconsider holding out. But siege tactics weren't just about weaponry and walls. What other ways did attackers use psychological warfare to weaken the defenders? Did the attackers simply wait for the defenders to starve? Or did they use more insidious methods to break their spirit and force them into surrender? The answer is more gruesome and more strategic than you might expect. Stay tuned, because the last phase of a siege was not just about battle, it was about breaking a person's will to fight. As the siege wore on, castles were often protected by more than just stone walls. Moats, deep ditches filled with water or even spikes, prevented attackers from getting too close. Drawbridges could be raised, leaving the attackers stranded outside. Crossing a moat could be deadly, with defenders pouring boiling oil or shooting arrows at anyone trying to make it across. So, how did attackers bypass these natural and man-made defenses? They used clever tactics to build temporary bridges, sneak across in the dead of night, or use raids to test the defenses, gradually weakening the castle's ability to resist. The real problem, though, was not just getting in. It was waiting out the defenders. Once surrounded, the defenders would eventually face starvation as their food and water supplies dwindled. Without any way to get fresh supplies, the defenders' ability to resist would collapse. As months went by, the walls could stand firm, but the defenders' morale would break, and hunger or disease would take its toll. It was only a matter of time before the defenders would have no choice but to surrender or face annihilation. Imagine the moment of surrender. After weeks, even months of pressure, the starvation, disease, and constant siege weapons finally brought the defenders to their knees. A flag of surrender would be raised, signaling the end of a long and grueling siege. But did it always end peacefully? Not always. Some castles, once surrendered, faced brutal retribution. But others, if the attackers were honorable, might allow the defenders to live in peace. The attackers had won through patience, psychological warfare, starvation, and sheer determination. But was it worth it? Was the price of the castle and its resources worth the cost in lives and resources spent? For many medieval armies, it was the key to survival, and the rewards were immense. Sieging a medieval castle was more than just a battle of strength. It was a complex, psychological, and grueling war of attrition. Attackers needed to be patient, clever, and merciless to break down the walls, and sometimes it wasn't about breaking the walls at all, but breaking the defenders' will to fight. What would it take to tear down the walls of a castle that seemed invincible? In medieval times, castles weren't just homes, they were the key to power and survival. But how did invaders manage to break into these fortress-like strongholds? Was it brute force, clever tactics, or something darker? In this video, we are uncovering the shocking methods attackers used to siege a castle and the incredible lengths they went to break through walls that seemed impossible to breach. Stay tuned to find out what it really took to conquer the mightiest fortresses of the medieval world. A medieval castle's defenses were formidable. Stone walls, deep moats, and drawbridges all made it nearly impossible for attackers to succeed. The first stage of a siege involved surrounding the castle to cut off supplies, leaving the defenders without food or water. But starvation alone wasn't enough. Invaders needed something more to break through those thick walls. And that's where siege weapons came in: battering rams, siege towers, and trebuchets. These terrifying tools were designed to break down gates, scale walls, and launch destruction from a distance. But what happens when the defenders hold strong, even after the walls start to crack? How do attackers maintain the pressure when their weapons are failing or when the defenders refuse to give up? The answer might surprise you. Attackers didn't just rely on force. Instead, they used psychological tactics and even disease to turn the tide. Think you know all there is to medieval siege warfare? Wait until you learn the dirty tricks that actually pushed defenders to surrender. As a siege dragged on, the attackers didn't just break down gates, they broke the will of the people inside. Diseased corpses were launched over castle walls, bringing more than just fear, they spread sickness. Psychological warfare was just as important as the physical weapons. The attackers knew that after weeks of no food, constant bombardment, and the threat of disease, the defenders would break. And when that moment came, the castle's gates would finally fall. Sieging a castle wasn't just about attacking walls. It was a brutal war of attrition, and the results were devastating. But how did it all end? Did the attackers succeed, or did the defenders fight back? You won't believe how some of these sieges turned out. Make sure to watch until the end to find out how these epic medieval battles ended and what it meant for both the victors and the vanquished.